Welcome to MeatsPad, a platform to share breakthrough knowledge that is accessible to the entire meat industry. Be ready to hear from meat specialists who will talk about numerous topics in meat science, including animal welfare, meat production, meat quality, and so much more.
Hello everyone, my name is Francisco Najar and I'm your host today. Our guest for this episode is Dr. John Michael Gonzalez. He is an associate professor from the University of Georgia. We'll be chatting today about animal stress in cattle and how that affects the meat industry. Welcome, Dr. Gonzalez. It's a pleasure to have you here. Before we start, how are you? How's your family? How are you guys handling all this situation with COVID-19?
We're doing good here in Watkinsville, Georgia, which is just right outside Athens. Currently coming to you live from my bedroom because I have to hide from my kids. Just itching to get back in the lab and conducting some research here at UGA and missing being in the lab and missing being around students.
I'm sure. So again, thank you. And so we'll start off this conversation. What is your take on the economic impact of animal organ stress in the beef industry?
Yeah. So that's a really good question and one that I didn't really think about. I think as far as beef is concerned, they're a little bit behind the big guys, where they have actual numbers they've conducted, and the guys just got done conducting a really large study with Elanco, where they actually have their economic impact, and I wouldn't say more economic impact, just their loss of income impact on antemortem stress factors. Beef guys are a little bit behind that. I think right now, I talked to Dr. Lily Edwards-Callaway at Colorado State University, who I asked her a question because you had asked me that the other day, and I was like, wow, that's a pretty good question. And so she said actually she's working on that right now, I believe, and getting more concrete type numbers. But she did publish a paper, and those of your listeners that are interested in learning more about this, there's a new paper that was published in the April version of Journal Animal Science that she goes over a lot of the welfare topics and issues, along with Dr. Michelle Calvo from Elanco, and they both go over the issues in the beef industry. And so it's a really good, nice review paper. And so one of the numbers she has in there, they don't have straight concrete numbers, because if you think about antemortem stress or even just what the economic impact it'll be, are you talking about just straight animals that'll die on the truck, animals that are stressed? So does that mean downtime? Does that mean, bad meat quality once the animals go through the harvest process? You may even talk about, stress from the standpoint of the animals bruising themselves and them having to cut off meat. So there's not really any concrete type numbers out there. I'm sure that the beef packers actually know that type of figure, but they may not have released that to the general knowledge of academics and the public. However, one figure she does have in there is the amount of animals that are condemned prior to slaughter, and they call them non-ambulatory animals that can't walk in on their own. They don't classify them much like the swine industry, where they're stressed or anything like that. But if you just use those straight numbers, you can say there's around, I looked at the figure this morning, 39 million head of cattle killed on average per year. The number of condemned animals due to stress and other factors, disease, and fed cattle end up being around 0.02%. And usually the general public would be like, oh, that's not very much, 0.02%. But if you actually think about that, 39 times that by 39 million head of cattle, that ends up being a pretty big number. And then you take the average cost of a 1,500 pound steer. That's what I was basing the calculation off of. And, based on market prices, which are always flip flopping everywhere. So that's why it makes it even more complicated to do this. I estimated a steer would be around $1,650 value, and probably true cattle guys would maybe flip at that number, but let's just say conservatively, that's what a beef animal would cost. You get anywhere that economic value being around $2.8 million lost per year. So overall, it's a big economic impact for the industry, especially if you're the packer absorbing those losses, or if you're the feedlot absorbing those losses. And so economic, it's a huge problem, and one that is starting to gain traction as far as figuring out ways to actually reduce stress in those animals as they come to slaughter.
Good. Thank you for sharing that. So I have the next question will be, okay, what happens in cattle when they undergo stress? When you mentioned like there's a very high proportion of those condemned animals, maybe due to the animal organ stress that occurs basically right before slaughter. So tell us a little bit about that, and how is your current research tackling this issue?
Yeah. So yeah, that's another one, super complicated question, and one that's not easily answered, because if you think about a beef animal, right, they're hanging out in the feedlot, living the life, I guess you would say. That the only time they have to move or whatever is to get up and go eat and go to the bathroom, and so that they have a really plush life in that sense, I guess you would say. And so they're low impact, and so we'll load them on trucks. Anytime that humans come around cattle, for the most part, depending on how the history of those cattle, whether they're from an area, let's say like the swamp of Florida, where they hardly ever see people, so they are very scared of people. Or if you even think about ones that have had negative experiences with humans, anytime a human-animal interaction occurs, as far as beef cattle are concerned, they get stressed out. And so most of the time when we do handle our animals, we're either moving them somewhere, or they're going through a chute, getting shots, getting on. And so it ends up not being a super pleasurable experience for them. And so they, most of the time when you start handling them, they get stressed out, right? And so, that's the first stress they'll run into, is actually getting them loaded onto the truck. Outside of that, or before that even happens, you may want to think too, all right, aside from the human interaction, what is the animal actually experiencing in the environment? During winter, is it really cold? Are they shivering? During summer, is it really hot and they're heat stressed? And so that's another issue to think about, and how we manage them as far as that's concerned. Put them on the truck. One of the big factors there is crowding. You don't want to crowd them too much on the actual transport trailer. That's kind of my interest right here at UGA. It started at K-State, of course, with you coming along on our rides, and so kind of characterizing the conditions of the transport trailer and how that affects. What I'm specifically interested in is actually the vibration patterns. And so have a hypothesis, and right now at UGA and the work that you participated with me at K-State was using pigs as a model. Pigs are a little bit easier to access for us at that point, and they were a little bit easier model to deal with. And so we end up, what we're looking at is putting on accelerometers that measure the vibration patterns and the up and down, the z-axis, the left and right, and the back and forth motions. And what we end up looking at is, are those vibrations causing the muscles of those animals to fatigue? And so I equate it to much like using a two-stroke engine. Those that use chainsaws or a weed eater for a long time, and then your hands are really tired and you can't, close your hands because you're fatigued, or you have to hold on to things. It's much the same principle that, are those vibrations in the trailers causing the animals to become fatigued? And so we're actually testing that right now in pigs. K-State still working with the bioag engineering gentleman there. And we're actually building a simulator that will simulate those vibration patterns. It'll be designed for both cattle and pigs, so we can put them in there and shake them and then see how their muscle profiles change. And so that's another one that we're interested in. But aside from that, what we're also tracking in the trucks with the pigs and can be translated over to cattle are the actual temperature and the environment in there. So humidity, temperature, are we wetting down the cattle during summer? Are we closing the slats? Because each of those transport trailers, they'll have the ability during winter time to close the slats so you don't let cold air in. And so are the transport operators actually getting those slats closed to prevent cold wind from coming over those animals? And so there's a lot of factors in there. One thing that we also don't realize is we're going to mix those animals with animals they're not familiar with. And of course, when we mix livestock with each other, they have to figure out a pecking order. So there are some of those dynamics too. And so it's a multifactorial problem, one that's really, for my approach, I think you start one at a time. I know a lot of other scientists all the factors in together. But that's, at this point at UGA, we're going to focus on vibrations. And then from there, build our simulator and start being able to control environment and all these other factors that attribute to those animals being stressed too.
I also recall you evaluating the location within the trailer. Do you think that also has an impact on stress, like the location within the trailer?
Yeah, so since the last time I talked to you, we actually, I met a engineer here, Dr. Ben Davis, and he actually worked on vibrations in rockets for NASA. He was a NASA scientist, and so I contacted him, and I wanted to put the data in numerical fashion, where we originally had it in what they called spectrograms, which are just color plots that show you based on color where the vibration's occurring. And what we ended up finding out is the back compartment in those potbelly trailers, which are the same ones that they use to ship cattle in, both cattle and pigs in Kansas. That one has the highest vibration profile. And then one of the neater things is a different type of truck that they use to transport pigs in North Carolina, where I've been collecting data when I moved over here to the Southeast. The middle section seemed to have a lot of vibration too. So, and so the middle type sections. And so, there are different compartments where there's different vibrations. One of the things we'll do is kind of get those vibration patterns worked out and then measure them on the pigs and say, okay, let's assume this pig is, and then let's vibrate him towards the middle and see how his muscle fatigue versus somebody that's in the back top, what they call the jailhouse. So I call it doghouse. I think that's incorrect, but for some reason I like to call it the doghouse. So that's kind of what we're looking at there. But there are, right now, our data would indicate there are different vibration patterns based on where you're getting transported in the truck.
Okay. All right. So this is the next question for you. This is transportation, and again, depending on the time, may result in fatigue. What is the overall meat quality impact when this occurs?
I think that I've heard, and I'm trying to think back to my days when I worked in a beef plant. You get these animals in. Most will want them to rest or go through lairage for about 2 hours, so to hopefully get some of their energy built back up from the transport. Of course, that all depends on transport time. And so, as far as fatigue, it just depends the amount of fatigue that those animals go through. So one of the things, like I talked about earlier, the human-animal interaction is a big thing before you put them on the truck. The number one thing getting them on the truck is how stressed you make them before you load them on the truck. And so if you treat them poorly, you have to run them a long distance. You run them really hard through the processing before they get on the truck. You end up getting them really tired, and they'll use up a lot of their energy. And so for the most part, what you end up getting is, in pigs, you'll end up getting, PSE or pale soft exudative pork, where the color is really pale. You get a lot of purge and the meat quality, and then overall the quality of the pork is just not very good when you cook it. And beef cattle, probably the one that's more of a problem is dark cutters. So you end up stressing them out to a point where they have no more energy in their muscle, and that has to do with a combination of stressing them before they get on the truck, and then also, probably energy being used while they're, because the difference with cattle is in pigs is some pigs will lay down in the trailer versus cattle, they don't have room to lay down, so they stand the whole time they're in transport. So depending on how far they have to move to go to slaughter, it ends up being a long time standing up, and so they'll end up being DFD or dark, firm, and dry. So what that told us is there's no energy in their muscle to actually have the normal pH decline that we get when muscle turns into meat. And so what that does is it allows the muscle to bind more water, which in theory you would think, oh, well, that kind of be a good thing. It has more water, it's going to be more juicy. But what it does is it ends up, consumers aren't used to that dark color, and so it freaks them out. So most of the time it won't even make it to the retail market, let's say for like Kroger or Publix or whatever grocery store you're shopping in. The other thing is it does have problems. You do end up having problems with palatability with that product because it has so much water, the beefy flavor probably most likely goes away.
Thank you. Next question. What would be your recommendation to the meat industry to try to minimize animal organ stress in cattle?
That's a really good question. As new research comes out, kind of think about how some of the things that Colorado State's finding out, that we're finding out, and some of the management practices that we're suggesting, kind of start to try to figure out how those could be accepting to their operations, and how they can incorporate that. But overall, I think at the end of the day, it all comes down to the human and animal interaction. And so, really training their personnel and driving home the concepts that handling those animals with the least amount of stress possible is probably going to be the best in everybody's interest. It's not only the best as far as meat quality and economically, it's also the right thing to do, right? Because, to take an animal and stress them out right before you end their lives is not the best ethical thing to do. And so kind of driving that home with their employees. And it's hard. I worked in a beef plant for about 9 months. I'm by no means an expert, but I learned a lot during those 9 months where, employees tend to get, we train them a lot, and then they end up being, you end up doing the same thing over and over every day. Some situations become very frustrating. And so really, teaching those employees to handle it, take a step back, take a breath, understand that these animals are scared, they're stressed, and we're trying to get them through a system that's loud and scary. So kind of reminding them of that and keeping the stress down and keeping their employees with the right frame of mind that, I need to keep these animals under the least amount of stress as possible is probably the number one thing. And that's, that's been known forever. Temple Grandin said that eons ago. And so, yeah, that's just kind of one of those things. I think constantly training and driving that concept home that we need to treat these animals with the least amount of stress as possible and prevent that. We do a lot of things like, bags on sticks, keep down the hooping and hollering. I think me coming from a city background, I always think of when people move cattle, you do that, hooping and hollering, ooh, kid, move on cow, stuff like that. But coming up with new methods of moving cattle, I think the neatest one that I saw in my time in industry was the young lady that worked for me. She ended up having a Dremel tool, but what we ended up doing was we just had a blunt tip on it. So it would just provide a little vibration to the hind end of the animal and keep them moving. So coming up with new methods of moving animals, stress-free methods is really is really something that I think producers should think about doing. And I think they're doing a job now, but as things change and as we learn more about how to reduce the stress in these animals, I think not being complacent is the number one thing I would say.
Thank you, and we thank you a lot for being here today. Thank you for sharing all that valuable information. We are coming to the end of today's episode. But before we let you go, I'd like you to answer just one question that we ask all of our guests. What is the most challenging part with you working from home?
Yeah, I think one of the things is the hardest thing that we've had to do, and luckily my wife's been here most of the time, so she's been on been on kind of home quarantine with me. Is we kind of juggle things. So when I have to do something like this, she watches the kids, and then when she has to teach class, her vet classes, I end up watching the kids. Which sometimes I don't do a good job, and the kids end up running into her class. But I think really writing is hard. I'm used to writing in a quiet environment. Not too quiet, but just in my office. I can sit there and concentrate. But you got to open a pack of gummy bears or whatever for the kids. That draws my attention, and trying to write with Mickey Mouse Clubhouse on the TV ends up being a hard thing to do too. And so that's been hard, kind of trying to write. But I think I've gotten better at that. The thing that I'll probably remember the most and I'll value the most about this is me. I traveled a lot at K-State. When I moved here, I was hoping I wouldn't travel as much, but I ended up, I was traveling a lot, especially right before the pandemic hit. And so I've missed a lot of time with my kids due to my job. And so sometimes I think this is maybe God's way of telling me, hey, I'm going to force you to be with your kids as they grow up. And so this has been really valuable time for me to watch my kids grow and spend a lot of time with them. And, my son will sit and take breaks, and I'll sit in the chair and he'll sit on top of me, and we'll take like a 10-minute nap or something. And so that's really great time for me and stuff that I'm sure I'll cherish and we'll look back upon and smile when we when this is all over. So it's not all bad. I've really enjoyed it from a family standpoint to be with my family a lot.
Yep, I totally agree with you on that one. With all this COVID-19 situation, we for sure spend more time with our families at home, and that can be challenging sometimes. All right, thank you again. And with this, we end this episode. We thank you, Dr. Gonzalez, and thank you, the audience, for listening to MeatsPad. Until the next time,